Commonweal, if we look at their New Green Deal, they expand on some of this issues as well. I think at some point we might need to clarify or share or come together in some kind of united way. But because we're the Radical Independence Campaign, it means that we're arguing that independence needs to be more than just, say, for instance, the Growth Commission, the one that's just recently came out, that's just full of, well, I'll be polite, it's neoliberalism gone large as far as Scotland is concerned. One of the things it says in the report is there is no time, obviously they're really keen on speed, maybe they're on speed, but nevertheless, what they're talking about is there's no time for new structures. None of that kind of fancy stuff here, son. What they want to do is to get on with their Growth Commission, which is basically very similar to what is in the here and now. And neoliberalism is writ large throughout it. So there is elements in the SNP, and we need to work with them, we need to talk to them, and we need to be part, they need to be part of us, and we need to be part of them. If we're going to put forward anything which is going to be of a radical nature to change the dialogue, the debate that's going on in Scotland about what's the solution. Obviously, if COVID-19 hadn't happened and we hadn't seen that the state has got great means at its disposal, it can print money. There's trees all over North Edinburgh called the magic money tree, which we've just to go out there and pick from the leaves as much money as we require to deal with all the other problems. And that's no true. So don't come down to North Edinburgh because it's no actually happening. But what we talk about when we talk about the Scottish Climate Service, really it's an embracing service. It includes, for instance, the National Investment Bank. It would include a public-owned energy company. It would be something which would be a new model that we would be able to argue when and if the question of independence goes back on the agenda as a possibility as we move towards a new referendum and the rest. When we were out in the streets as the Radical Independence Campaign, we were clear what we were arguing, and it cut with so many people, and it tapped into the need of what we're talking about. So even on top of what was previously when we were arguing in the States and the rest, we knew that we couldn't rely on the market. The market is a complete failure. We've seen from the reports that have went out on, say, for instance, the North Sea, we know that all those companies, the BPs, the Exxons, the rest, the Shells, have milked the North Sea. When you look at Norway, and you know, I'm not putting that forward as a hugely radical country in the world, but nevertheless, they did something slightly right, which was to get a share of the wealth. What we did is we took on the responsibility. First of all, we invested, we subsidised, and we were the people who will pick up the tab at the end. So it was capitalism for us and socialism for the bosses. In a sense, what we've seen is that the huge loss or revenue that could have been stored up, like I'm going to come on to when the question of storing electricity, how we could do that type of thing if we had an energy company, and not just something that sells us electricity slightly cheaper than you know, National Grid or the British Gas or one of the other companies. But actually, what I'm going to argue is that the market, and we've experienced it, how it's failed. It's failed over COVID-19, and it's failed over what we believe to be the answer to the climate crisis, which is a just transition. If we rely on the market, then in fact what we will see is something colossal. When we looked at the steel industry, I think there was about 14,000 job losses, and we thought that was terrible. We thought that that was a disgrace, and it should never have happened. But when you look at the 10,000 were lost in the pits in Scotland, what's going to happen in the coming months and years over the disaster on the North Sea, the milk cow, the one that was going to save our future, is in fact in rapid decline. There is a number of papers, briefings, articles that people can refer to. I would say to you, look at some of the writings of Commonweal, but also Scott E3, and the briefing papers that it's produced, so that people can see what the argument is. But also there was a TV program, we can probably put a link on to that describes what's happened in the North Sea, and the way in which the tax revenue that was to come to us, like the Norway situation, who have got over £1 billion pounds, sorry, whatever the currency is there, in the locker to be able to utilise and tap into and whatever. We've got none of that. In fact, we're going to be left with a huge bill unless we can work a way in which we can get those costs to us, the taxes to us. But that will need more than just a little bit of persuasion. It's not about clever words. It's about mobilisation. And we need to be tapping in to the fears that North Sea oil workers, there could be potentially something like 200,000 or job loss over a phased period, but nevertheless, something in the region of 70,000 have already been axed at this present moment. It is a colossal amount of money. When you looked at its peak, it was probably the wage bill for the North Sea ran into billions of pounds. And that then went back in £3.4 billion went back into local economy of Scotland and helped to buy goods and people to be able to pay their bills, etc., etc. There is no urgency on the market to find a solution to the question of climate. If we have really got only 8, 9, 10 years, 11 years to deal with this, then to be honest, it has to be radical and it has to be fast. And we need to see a Scottish government following the Growth Commission, but actually wiping the slate and looking at it afresh and seeing what's necessary. So a Scottish climate service would in fact be a state-run organisation. But if we just allowed that to happen, I worked on it initially under the nationalised industry. It was called the South of Scotland Electricity Board. And I have to tell you, it wasn't a workers' paradise. There was bosses, there was sackings, there was fights, there was strikes, etc., etc. So I'm not saying that model. We need to have transparency, we have to have democracy, we have to create a buy-in, a voice for communities across Scotland to come together to demand urgency and demand change. Of course, there is an election in May, and we might have an opportunity as the Radical Independence Campaign to be able to start talking about the nuts and bolts of how this would happen. So I'm in favour of us being able to work out and put some demands. I did suggest, and I'm sure that Alan before agreed with us, was that we needed some kind of radical independence coming together much sooner than later to talk about what we stood for, what is our analysis, and how we can do this. So really, in a sense, we need to have that Scottish Climate Service with those elements within it that talk about how we can create the 100,000 jobs. I mean, if you look at and see how energy We need to have massive public heating schemes, and that they'll involve, yeah, a lot of money, but spread over the next 20 years. We could see every house, or the majority of houses, unless they were isolated, and even then is possible, for that to be connected, for the refit of lots of housing into insulated, so that the heating loss, you know, there's about 90% of houses, 95% of houses that pour out carbon into the atmosphere, and we definitely need to capture that element, and that needs building workers, it needs backup, it needs supply, whatever. When we look at that 100,000 jobs, that could be the help and support for people who will have to lose their jobs if we're going to deal with the climate in a proper way. We could have hydrogen. It's a combination of hydrogen and gas, but to a controllable level. I think it's less than 10% of hydrogen could be mixed with natural gas. But the problem then is it's very combustible, and you don't want your house to blow up anytime soon. So what we need to do is we need to have a proper argument about solutions, but there is enough out there. I mean, in the stuff that I've read in the last couple of days, there is clearly enough people thinking about it. We don't really need to think way beyond what we've already got, but it would be a starting point. So people like Brian and others who have done a great deal of work should really be looked at, what they've contributed, and we should put that into a package that then demands it. Part of the climate service would certainly be planning, it would be research, it'd be controlling the investment, and looking at how production and distribution, not only in energy, I mean, people think just transition is about the oil workers, and it is for a big part because it's the most urgent. But what we're seeing now is the need for other people to be part of that. So training, the whole question about universities and further colleges should be the redundancies and the way that people are being threatened right now in the educational institutions across Scotland really need to be taken up as a fight now by radical independents. Because if we're going to have people trained, developed, inspired, giving them a voice, allowing them to progress plans and dreams and whatever, then we need to have an education. So it does fit. I think we can't spell out everything because people can add to it, can debate it and can discuss it. But we need to find allies, and the Radical Independence Campaign needs to have a focus on what it's saying. And it doesn't have to have a referendum now, though it'd be preferable, but it needs to have a voice on what it's saying about the possibilities, like currency, that failure, the last time, and all the rest, dealing with the nitty-gritty of what was thrown at us. We need to have an answer to the question about people's life at the present moment, and we need to have that in communities, but we also need that in workplaces. So places that are not necessary for the future, we need to have that hard argument, but we have to give people a path from one set of jobs where they can earn to another set of jobs that at once, even if it needs trained, that they can live and have a living for their families and the rest. And I think we can win that battle, but we need to be more upfront, vocal, visible than we are at the present moment. But there is a few opportunities coming up, and I think that's what we need to do. And I'll shut up at that.
I'm going to sort of begin really by saying I was a bit disappointed by your introduction, Willie, to be honest. Partly because most of the people I've ever heard criticise the Growth Commission have never actually read it. Because if they had, they would know there are things like having a gender pay commission, having an industrial strategy, having a development strategy for national grids, having renewable energy as the prime form of energy, having an independent currency within a certain time. That is all in there as well. As all these things are necessary steps to create an independent state. Obviously, it was written in 2018, prior to all the stuff that's gone on since, prior to Brexit happening, prior to the global slump that we've had with COVID, and also prior to the recent, more long-term, but nonetheless really deep crisis around automation and the possible loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs due to them going out of existence due to obsolescence. So these are three massive challenges, which of course mean that frankly, that document was out of date before it was written. So, but there are things in it which I think are things that we need to actually embrace, because they're actually things that you will require in an independent country. So that's my first caveat, is please actually read all of it, read all the recommendations, not just the ones you don't agree with, because there's many I don't agree with, but there's 50 recommendations, 43 of them are totally supportive for socialists, and we should support them. So there we are. But I'm going to go on to the actual subject for today, which is, I'm going to sort of work it through from what I understand to be Commonweal's understanding from the document they have called A Common Home. And there are a number of things in there which I think are really important to this discussion about what kind of investment that will an independent Scotland require to make real progress around climate change. And this speaks to whether we should actually have a specific service or not to do this, and what role the state has and what role the market has. I'm going to go through some of the listing of items. I think they speak volumes. But essentially, Commonwealth put out a document saying that for £170 billion cost, there could be an industrial strategy which reduces the effect of climate change and actually carbon neutral proofs us for the future. And it goes as follows: improving thermal energy efficiency of existing housing stock. That's one of the biggest polluters, £40 billion. District heating systems to replace boilers, gas burning boilers. That would cost £25 billion to do that across the country. Putting district heating ring mains in, that would cost £9 billion. Support for small and medium businesses improving thermal performance of their buildings, £3 billion. Upgrading thermal efficiency of public buildings, £5 billion. Installation of new renewable energy capacity, £21 billion. Nationalisation of existing energy capacity, £10 billion. Upgrading the electricity grid and installing local battery storage, £4 billion. You get the picture. There's several specific things, but one of the important ones is around zero carbon travel and making battery technology able to be refueled easily. Hydrogen, use of hydrogen and electrolysis as energy forms of use. Having a national resources agency to invest in the transition to a circular economy. And this concept of what a circular economy is, in that definition, there's no such thing as waste, because all the resources that we generate from our economic activity can be reused in a way that's circular and doesn't leave a carbon footprint. In effect, we obviously know that capitalism is a very wasteful system of production, exchange, and use, and it's that's coming under question, actually, even under COVID, because we've all noticed just how much our carbon footprint has reduced, because we're making far fewer journeys. Although we're sitting at home eating more pizza, so arguably we're probably throwing out more reusable plastics and cardboard. We actually have less of a carbon footprint in the way that we're doing business now, because far more unnecessary journeys to meetings and in buildings that are heated with inefficient fuel sources are not happening. So the building back better ideas that people have had, of course, talking about what elements of what we're doing now will continue after the worst element of the COVID crisis has risen. What sectors of our economy will still be here in the same way? We know that a lot of people in terms of employment, not just in the energy sector, have been, particularly in hospitality and tourism, have been affected by these reductions in economic activity. So we all recognize that anything that was written prior to this period of time is out of date and not relevant to where we're going next. I suppose what we are fighting for as radicals is that we want an independence that actually does say what it wants to do, which is to create equality between its citizens, batten down on the super rich, do things like make land accessible to the people. So obviously a transformation of land practices, that will cost some money because we'd have to invest in land. That would cost 10 billion quid according to Commonweal. Having an industrial strategy where the workforce is properly trained and developed, that requires government intervention, so state intervention in the way that the supply chain from universities and the development of knowledge and products that we will then use will be a circular process of an industrial strategy. These are the things that are missing because the economy is unplanned in the way that it is. What regulatory influences our government has are very limited because the main economic levers are not in Scotland's hands. The tax regime, the monetary regime, and the major investments, although the Scottish government is able to do something around investments, too often that investment has been predominantly within the roads-based infrastructure rather than in renewable forms of transport infrastructure. So we also need to think about our town centres and how they're organised. Commonweal has obviously had some thought about food distribution, supply chain shortening, things like that, which will make it possible for these unnecessary journeys to be eliminated, which are in our climate, and also to preserve the kind of employment that would be more viable. One of the things, of course, is that Scottish town centres, and if you know Greenock is the poorest town centre in our country, it's the poorest ward, the town centre ward, its shops are empty, and the likelihood of any kind of wasteful forms of consumption and those kind of companies returning to Scottish town centres is very minimal, and they're not something we should desire and or should be trying to attract. What we should be trying to say is trying to relocalise our economies so that the economic and social relations between us, as we have created it, before and since the COVID outbreak, there are things that we do which are social goods, which are a benefit economically too, which we can use to generate economic activity, which obviously help people in terms of providing social services, whether it's housing, whether it's transportation, helping the people with disabilities, whatever it is that people do to help. These social activities can be used to revitalise local town centres. People should start living in them again. Some of these unnecessary empty offices that we're heating and lighting at night should be used and transformed into socially rented housing so that town centres again thrive with people. These are the sorts of things in terms of how we design our society which a climate service would be of help to us. And a climate service would be good in terms of protecting the intellectual base, having the brains trust, if you like, also having the skilled workforce on hand to assist with infrastructure companies. You'll know that last year the SNP passed a policy on creating a national infrastructure company. So that is now, it's actually the government's policy, and I know we're not the only party that has had that policy put through. So there's an agreement quite across the broad sector that we should have state or organised institutions to intervene in these structures to save cost, have economy of scale, link between colleges and universities to skill up the workforce so that they have got other possibilities. Just transition won't happen without massive resource investment in education, retraining and reorganising. But it also won't happen without things like the reduction of the working week. The idea of a capitalist economy in the way it's operating with everybody working 48 hours a week or more to earn a decent wage, that is not viable in the future ahead of us. So we have to be talking about reducing the working week down to a sizable manner. It might be down to 2 or 3 days a week. So work is shared out, because otherwise we will have mass unemployment for a long period ahead. So the kind of independence that we're going to be discussing next year around the election, or if there's a referendum, which looks very likely afterwards, is going to be what kind of Scotland or what kind of balance between state and markets that we're going to have afterwards. Now, my view is that I'm not in favour of a socialism that defines the state as owning everything as the answer. As Willie has pointed out, working for the state is not always a wonderful thing, especially if it's not under workers' control, or if it's not under any great democratic scrutiny, and if there's a massive bureaucracy. It doesn't necessarily deliver something better than the existing arrangements. What we've got to ensure is that the people, in the form of the workforce and the communities in which these state institutions serve, have a vested practical input into the decision-making process around how resources are allocated. And in a climate plan, that is not going to work without those people. You know, if you don't have parents who are walking their kids to school instead of taking a car, or who have a bus or whatever, or take cycling, for example, there's a massive investment going on in that right now, quite rightly. Policies in city centres like Glasgow are being introduced right now in terms of pop-up cycle lanes, which would not have been possible. George Square is closed now. There was massive opposition to us doing that, but that's happening because the way we're now having to work and the way we're travelling to and from work has already slightly changed significantly, and it's likely that that will set the tone for how we're going to operate in the very near future. So I'm putting out those thoughts, thinking that, well, will a climate change service, a Scottish climate service, which deals with obviously the science of how we do it, gives us measurable targets in a sort of Green New Deal way that we can actually achieve, sets targets for public bodies to actually achieve by a certain set time. I believe that the deadline that we've set ourselves so far in the government, which I think is 2045, it's sooner than everybody else, but it's not sufficient. We are a country that's probably one of the closest in the world to being able to be 100% renewably self-sufficient, and closer to being a circular economy pre-COVID. The question is, post-COVID, can we take advantage of what we've had to give up and develop new areas and new ways of economically collaborating between citizens, which will allow us to continue those advantages? These are questions I raise. I don't necessarily have all the answers to this, but I certainly think that the demands that the radical left should be raising are to push that development further, to create as much social control of resources, capital, of ownership of land and industrial development, and of the processes around them. And that we don't allow the market to decide those things, particularly around housing. I think it's very important that we don't leave it to them, and that we create a Scottish infrastructure company as part of that service to do it.